This boy is not my son. 0% match.
This boy is not my son.
Jaehun, the young boss of a Korean-American crime family that had built its power base in Brooklyn, New York. The firelight in the study flickered over a single sheet of paper. Jaehun's fingers wouldn't let go of it, trembling. Just 30 minutes ago, this room had been full of a newborn's cries. Now, only the crackle of the fireplace remained, and somehow the silence felt louder for it. Jaehun didn't set the papers down. He gripped the edge until his knuckles went white.
0% match.
3 digits had swallowed the last 3 years of his life whole. It was the first time in his life that the name Jaehun had ever felt this small. 3 years earlier, in a jazz club in Brooklyn, on a night thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of a piano, Jasmine, a stunning black woman with deep brown skin and a full, natural afro, played the keys like she was walking across them, the hem of her black dress trailing behind her. Every time the light caught the curve of her afro, it seemed the whole room's attention followed right along with her. That night, Jaehun learned, for the first time, how to buy flowers instead of guns. They hadn't exchanged many words, but every time her fingers pressed the keys, something inside him pressed down right along with them.
You come here often? Same seat, same drink, same silence. Every time.
Starting today, I'll come every day. And I'll change the drink, the seat, and the silence, too.
It wasn't a lie. For the next 3 years, Jaehun kept slipping past, his organization's watchful eyes to sit in that same corner of the club, and 4 seasons turned in that seat. Jasmine, guarded at first, slowly opened her heart to this stubborn foreign man who showed up at the same hour, in the same chair, night after night. The day Hajun was born, Jaehun knelt in a hospital hallway and prayed for the first time in his life. But the Lee family had an old custom. A newborn heir's bloodline had to be proven with a test, a cold-blooded rule passed down for 3 generations. It was a tradition kept ever since Jaehun's grandfather moved the family's business from Busan to New York, and no one had ever dared question it.
If the bloodline isn't proven, this child cannot carry the family name. That's the rule, Jaehun.
Jaehun had thought the whole thing was absurd. No one in that room knew better than he did how much Hajun's eyes looked like his own. He'd figured it was just a formality, and so he'd gone along with the test without protest. The morning the results arrived, the magnolias in the estate garden had bloomed unusually white. Jaehun would later recall that, looking at those flowers, he'd felt an odd chill run through him for no reason. As it turned out, that chill had a reason. No one knew it yet. The lawyer's hand trembled slightly, unusually, as he held out the envelope. Jaehun didn't notice. This man had managed every piece of paperwork for the Lee family for over 10 years, and it wasn't like him to shake.
The results are in. Please take a look.
As he tore open the envelope, the paper inside crackled like dried leaves. 0% match. Jaehun's eyes returned to that number again and again. No matter how many times he read it, the number didn't change. The ticking of the clock in the room sounded unusually loud. His heart beat slower than that, ticking much slower. His father's portrait on the wall seemed somehow to be looking down at him.
We lived together for 3 years. And this child isn't mine? That can't be. That can't be right.
Betrayal came before the anger did, and the anger came later than the grief. His emotions arrived out of order, and all Jaehun could do was stand there, clutching the paper. Outside the window, the setting sun cast a long shadow across the study floor, and that shadow seemed to grow darker and darker, just like his heart. That night, knowing nothing, Jasmine put Hajun to sleep. Humming as she kissed his forehead, her fingertips were still the fingertips of a pianist. On the windowsill sat a potted plant she cherished a rosemary Jaehun had given her as their first gift, still alive and growing after 3 years. Outside her door, Jaehun's footsteps stopped, but the door didn't open. From that night on, Jaehun slowed his pace every time he passed her door, but he never once knocked. All it would have taken was a single word. But to a man raised in the world of the Mafia, betrayal had taught him silence before it ever taught him how to explain. By the 6th day, Jasmine noticed for the first time that something had changed in his eyes. In the place where warmth had been, a strange ice had settled in, even sitting across from each other at the table. Only the clatter of forks and knives filled the silence conversation had vanished long ago.
What's going on with you lately? You didn't even show your face the day Hajun had a fever.
Jaehun looked away instead of answering. It wasn't until much later that he understood how heavy that silence had been, heavier than any words could have been. Outside, the lights of the Brooklyn Bridge shattered across the water. And just like that light, the distance between the two of them was shattering too, piece by piece. No one knew that the root of this silence had grown from somewhere entirely different. Not his study, not her door. Jasmine found a teacup sitting untouched outside Jaehun's study door. The cold, forgotten tea, with a thin layer of dust settled on top, bothered her more than it should have. 3 days now, same spot, same cup.
Is this man even eating?
Muttering to herself, Jasmine cleared the cup away. She found it almost funny that worry came before resentment. But that was just how she loved. Jaehun's mother had died young, and his father had been killed by a rival's bullet. The love he'd learned had always ended in loss, and so he'd learned how to let go long before he ever learned how to hold on. The old man who managed the estate had watched over this house since Jaehun was a boy. Jasmine happened to overhear him muttering to himself in the kitchen.
That look on his face, same one he had the day his father died. Whenever that man's hiding something, he gets that exact look.
Jasmine turned the words over in her mind. It occurred to her, for the first time, that whatever Jaehun was hiding might not be betrayal. It might be fear. But she had no way to be sure. And without that certainty, she had to endure 6 more days. Days that felt longer than the 3 years before them. On the morning of the 7th day, Jaehun finally opened the door to Hajun's room. He stood there a long while, just listening to the baby's sleeping breath in the crib. He reached out to touch the child's cheek, then pulled his hand back. Draped over the crib was a small blanket Jasmine had embroidered by hand herself, and in the corner, stitched in clumsy, careful letters, were the 3 characters of Hajun's name.
He has my eyes. His smile even has my dimple. So why?
As he stepped out of the room, Jasmine was standing behind him. For the first time in 6 days, their eyes met. But Jaehun said nothing and walked right past her. The hallway light stretched his shadow out long behind him, and that shadow lingered there for a long, long time. Watching him go, Jasmine understood for the first time that this marriage that had never quite felt like a marriage was heading toward its end. On the morning of the 7th day, Jasmine pulled out a suitcase and began folding her clothes into it. Last of all, she packed Hajun's blanket, his bottle, and a worn piece of sheet music. The same melody Jaehun had scribbled down for her on the spot, the night they first met at the jazz club.
I can't live in a house where I'm not loved. Not for my sake, and not for his.
Her knuckles had gone white around the suitcase handle. Footsteps sounded from downstairs. It was Jaehun. The 2 of them stood there, one at the top of the stairs, one at the bottom, like 2 people from entirely different worlds. Jasmine wheeled her suitcase toward the front door. Jaehun didn't block her path. He only said one low, cracked sentence.
If you're going, then go. I don't have the right to stop you. Not anymore.
Whether it was an apology or a resignation, Jasmine couldn't tell. The sound of the front door closing echoed down the long hallway. And that night, the first snow of the season began to fall over the Brooklyn Bridge, snow no forecast had predicted. Jaehun stood at the window and watched, all the way to the end, as the snow slowly erased her figure into white. That was the beginning of this story and the start of its longest silence. Jasmine walked through the snow-streaked night with her suitcase, holding Hajun close. She wandered the Brooklyn streets with no destination in mind. Just as her feet had gone numb with cold, she stopped beneath the sign of an old jazz club. Its owner, Nadia, was the only person who'd put Jasmine on a stage back when she was still nobody. Beneath the glow of the sign, Jasmine hesitated a long while, gripping the suitcase handle before she finally knocked. Inside, Nadia, who'd already been closing up for the night, startled at the sound and opened the door.
Jasmine, what are you doing out here this late, with the baby too? You look like a ghost.
I just need a place to stay. Just for one night.
Nadia didn't ask any more questions. She went straight to clearing off the old couch in the back room. There's a kind of kindness in this world that needs no explanation. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Jasmine fell asleep looking up at someone else's ceiling. Hajun's small breathing was the only sound filling the unfamiliar room. An old saxophone hung on the wall, a quiet witness to the club's glory days, long past. Jasmine closed her eyes and found herself thinking, unbidden, of the rosemary plant she'd left behind at the estate. The next morning, Jasmine left Hajun with Nadia and headed for the lab where the test had been done. Her own reflection in the subway window looked like a stranger's. The self who'd first come to this city 3 years ago, and the self she was now seemed to overlap in that glass. The receptionist didn't recognize her, just flipped through paperwork.
If you'd like to dispute the results, you'll need to fill out a retest application. The process is a bit involved, is that all right?
Give me the form. I want this test done from scratch. Every sample theirs, mine. All of it. No exceptions.
Jasmine's voice didn't waver. Instead of breaking her down, the injustice had straightened her spine. As she signed the papers, her fingers carried none of the tears of the last 6 days, only a hard, unshakable resolve. The clerk glanced up at her and, almost without meaning to, sped up the paperwork. Jasmine's steps as she left the lab were far lighter than they'd been walking in. At that same hour, in the estate's sitting room, Jaehun's right-hand men were talking in low voices. It had been a while since the snow outside had stopped, but the air inside the house was still frozen solid. For 3 days now, the boss's meal trays had been coming back out untouched.
You think the boss is going to fall apart like this? 3 days without eating.
Shut your mouth. Say something like that in front of the boss, and you won't have a tongue left to say anything else with.
Just then, the sitting room door opened, and in walked Derek Coleman, boss of a rival organization. Dressed in black like he was here for a funeral, every word of comfort he offered came laced with thorns. The expensive bottle of whiskey he'd brought only made the true purpose of his visit seem more suspicious. It had been a long time since these two bosses, from organizations with little contact between them, had sat down face to face. The men exchanged glances and quietly slipped out of the room.
Tough break, Jaehun. Guess you never really know a woman when you don't know where she comes from. Your old man got caught up with one like that too, didn't he? Or so I heard.
Jaehun didn't respond, but his eyes, fixed on Derek, had sunk a shade darker than usual. After Derek left, Jaehun stayed behind alone, staring out the window. The whiskey bottle he'd left sat untouched on the table. Outside, the New York skyline was fading into red as the sun went down.
Why is that man suddenly coming around to offer condolences? 10 years without a word from him.
The question flickered through his mind, and then quickly sank back into thoughts of Jasmine. All night, he'd given orders to find out where she'd gone, without ever explaining to himself why he was doing it. The urge to hold on to her, and the shame of having no right to do so, pressed down on him in turns. In the end, he threw on his coat and left the estate. When his men moved to follow, he raised a hand, signaling he'd go alone. That night, Jaehun pulled his black sedan up outside Nadia's club. He'd come straight over the moment his men reported back. The unfamiliar sound of a saxophone drifted out from inside, and just as Jasmine stepped out the back door, the two of them came face to face in the middle of the alley. One of the street lamps kept flickering. Jaehun got out of the car without even bothering to close his coat and walked straight toward her.
How did you even find this place?
Wherever you are, I have no choice but to find out. That's just the world I live in.
Jasmine couldn't tell if that was tenderness or a threat. Regret and obsession were tangled together in Jaehun's eyes. two feelings pushing each other away while never quite letting go. A snowflake, not yet melted, sat on the shoulder of his coat. Somehow, the sight of it made him look almost pitiful, and Jasmine found herself looking away.
If you're going to leave, I'll burn this whole city down before I let you go.
Hearing that, Jasmine realized all over again just how twisted this man's way of loving was. A man who'd hold on tight and never once say he was sorry. That was exactly who Jaehun was. She gripped the suitcase handle tighter. A cold wind cut through the alley between them.
Then start with an apology. Holding on without an apology isn't love. It's just captivity.
For a moment, Jaehun couldn't find the words. He'd sat across countless negotiating tables running his organization. But in front of this woman, he'd become a man who couldn't get a single sentence out right. He'd never once, in his whole life, said the word sorry. That was simply the world he'd been raised in. Eyes that hadn't so much as flinched under the barrel of a gun were right now adrift and shaking.
I've already filed for a retest. This time, not through your lab, through one I chose myself. Until the results come back, stay away from me. And from Hajun.
Jasmine's declaration left no room for argument. Jaehun stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but watch her walk away. The streetlight at the end of the alley caught the curve of her afro, and for a moment, she looked just like she had that night at the jazz club 3 years ago. Except back then, she'd been walking toward him. Now, her back was turned. Jaehun couldn't even lift a hand to stop her. All he could do was follow her with his eyes. The suitcase wheels rattled off over the frozen alley pavement, growing fainter with distance. The difference was, this time, it was her own 2 feet carrying her away from him. Left alone, Jaehun didn't get back in the sedan. He just stood there for a long while. The street lamp at the mouth of the alley flickered, stretching and shrinking his shadow over and over. One of his men approached cautiously to open the car door, but Jaehun waved him off.
An apology. When was the last time I ever said sorry to anyone?
He couldn't remember. In his world, an apology was the same as admitting weakness. But that night, for the first time, Jaehun found himself wondering if the rule he'd lived by all this time had been wrong. The snow still hadn't let up, and somewhere in those falling flakes, he found himself thinking of Derek Coleman's smile. He couldn't say why, but that smile kept nagging at him. Jaehun didn't head back to the estate that night. He stayed in that alley for a long time. It was in that same moment that he called his lawyer and told him to go back through every page of the test records from the very beginning. Back at the club, Nadia handed Jasmine a cup of coffee and asked her quietly. It was nearly midnight, but Nadia settled onto the couch as though she meant to stay until Jasmine fell asleep.
That man I overheard, Derek Coleman. Why does that name keep coming up here?
Jasmine turned to look at Nadia, startled. She had no idea how Nadia would even know that name.
There was a rumor, a long time back, that some lab in this neighborhood had fallen into Derek Coleman's hands. I always figured it was nothing but talk.
Nadia's words were brief, but their weight was anything but light. The moment Jasmine heard them, a chill ran down her spine. Coincidence seemed too generous a word for how neatly everything was lining up. That night, Jasmine pulled out the copy of her retest application and looked it over carefully once again. Outside, the snow had stopped, but inside her, a new storm was gathering. At Nadia's suggestion, Jasmine started performing at the club again in the evenings. It had been 3 years since she'd last stood on a stage, but her hands remembered the rhythm astonishingly well. Hajun would fall asleep in a little basket beside the stage, his mother's playing serving as his lullaby. On the first night, her fingers stumbled over the keys more than once, but by the 3rd night, she'd found the old rhythm again, completely.
See, your hands remember everything. What were you so worried about, all these 3 years?
At Nadia's teasing, Jasmine laughed out loud for the first time in ages. Even laughter itself felt strange and unfamiliar to her now. The tips a few customers left behind each night became her and Hajun's meals. One of the regulars, an old man who played trumpet, said the same thing to her, low, every time she finished a set.
There's sorrow sitting on those fingers of yours, kid. But somehow, that's what makes the music better.
Every time she heard it, Jasmine smiled faintly. In that worn-out club, she was learning, piece by piece, that sorrow could become something you build with. At that same hour, the Lee family's lawyer sat holed up in the study, going back through the entire test record from the very beginning. On the third sleepless night, buried in a mountain of paperwork, his eyes stopped on a corner of one document. 5 cold cups of coffee were lined up on his desk.
This isn't the lab's usual format.
He pulled out a magnifying glass to examine the faint logo printed at the bottom of the form. Printed slightly blurry, it was almost, but not quite, the official lab mark. The strokes were subtly off. It was a difference no one would ever catch without looking closely. If he hadn't had 20 years of experience, this tiny discrepancy might never have come to light.
Someone deliberately, very carefully imitated this.
He immediately began cross-referencing it against other documents. The handwriting on the signature lines, the placement of the stamps, even the texture of the paper. With each detail he checked, his unease hardened into certainty. He hurried to grab his coat, eager to bring this news to Jaehun. The next day, the lawyer went to the lab in person. Inside the reception area, a young researcher on the night shift visibly flustered the moment he laid eyes on him. Beads of cold sweat had formed on his forehead under the fluorescent lights.
If this is about that case, I really don't know anything. I just processed the paperwork like I was told to.
Told by whom exactly?
The researcher fell silent, but his trembling fingers kept glancing, involuntarily, toward the desk drawer. The lawyer didn't miss it. He softened his voice, though he made it clear he had no intention of backing down, and asked again,
I'm not here to punish you. I just need the truth.
At those words, the researcher's shoulders visibly shook. He stared down at the floor for a long time, before finally, heavily, he began to speak. When the lawyer asked him to open the drawer, the researcher hesitated a long while, before finally pulling out an envelope and handing it over. Inside was a large sum of cash and several blank forms, unsigned. On the front of the envelope, instead of a sender's name, only 2 unfamiliar initials were written.
Who exactly gave you this money?
A man in a black suit. I don't know his name, but his card had the last name Coleman on it. He just said the results needed a little adjustment.
The lawyer felt the strength go out of his legs right there on the spot. He'd handled every contract and lawsuit for this family for 3 years. But this was the first time he'd ever held such unmistakable evidence in his hands. He carefully gathered up the envelope and the forms and quietly gave the researcher one last piece of advice.
Don't tell anyone about this conversation from this point on. I'll find a way to protect you too.
Back at the estate, the lawyer set the envelope down in front of Jaehun without a word. Jaehun flipped through the forms inside, one by one, and said nothing. The fire in the study fireplace had gone out somewhere along the way, leaving the room cold.
What is all this? Are you telling me every bit of this from start to finish was Derek Coleman's doing?
The lab employee's testimony and the physical evidence both confirm it. The test itself was fabricated.
The papers trembled in Jaehun's grip. He stood there, closing his eyes for a long moment. What washed over him before the anger was a bone-deep regret for everything he'd done to Jasmine over those few days. The lawyer stepped back quietly, giving him the space to face this alone.
I pushed her away, with that icy silence.
Jaehun sank to the study floor, as though his legs had given out beneath him. Whether it was 3 sleepless, starving days finally catching up with his body, or his heart giving way first, and his body following after, no one could say. The lawyer quietly left the room, and Jaehun remained there alone for a long while. His father's portrait on the wall seemed, that day, to be looking down at him more intently than ever.
Did my father go through nights like this too?
No one answered that question. Only the darkness outside the window swallowed it, quietly. That same night, back at Nadia's club, Hajun suddenly spiked a fever. Jasmine stopped mid-song and rushed off the stage to gather him into her arms. His forehead was burning hot.
It's okay. It's okay. Mommy's here.
Jasmine spent the whole night holding Hajun in a chair in the emergency room waiting area. The fact that no one was there beside her had never felt so painfully sharp, not once in the past 3 years. But she didn't cry. Instead of crying, she wiped his forehead with a damp cloth and endured the night. The waiting room clock read 3 in the morning, and the fluorescent light overhead felt unusually pale.
I told myself, over and over, that I'd be fine on my own. But tonight, of all nights, those words feel weak. I wish someone were here with me.
A nurse came over to explain the fever medication, and Jasmine finally let out the breath she'd been holding. Watching Hajun's forehead slowly cool, she held his tiny hand tight. Just before dawn, Jaehun finally left the estate and headed for Nadia's club. But Jasmine wasn't there. Nadia, who'd been keeping watch over the club all night, looked Jaehun up and down, exhausted.
Hajun spiked a fever. They went to the hospital. And you think you've got any right to show up here?
Nadia's words were sharp, but there was worry woven into them too. Jaehun couldn't get a word out. He just asked, right there, for the name of the hospital. His voice was lower and more urgent than she'd ever heard it. Faced with that desperation, Nadia relented and told him the hospital's name.
Street Mary's. And if you're just gonna stand there again with that iceberg face of yours, don't even bother coming.
Without a word, Jaehun turned and broke into a run. It was the first time Nadia had ever seen him move that fast. Just before sunrise, Jaehun arrived at the hospital's emergency waiting room. Jasmine sat with Hajun in her arms, half dozing. Against the back of her chair, an old blanket lay draped thin over her shoulders.
How did you even know I was here?
Jaehun said nothing. He simply knelt down beside her. No one had ever seen the boss of a 3-generation Mafia dynasty kneel on a hospital hallway floor, but he didn't care.
It was all fabricated. Derek Coleman bribed the lab to swap the results. Hajun. He was my son from the very beginning.
Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes. Injustice and relief crashed over her at the same time, and for a while, she couldn't say anything at all. Through it all, Hajun slept soundly.
Before I believe that, don't you owe me an apology first? 6 days without a single word from you.
I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. For doubting you. For pushing you away without a word of explanation. For all of it.
Jaehun's voice broke. It was the first apology he'd spoken aloud in 30 years of living. Jasmine looked down at him for a long moment, then quietly reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder. It wasn't full forgiveness. Not yet, but at least that night the ice had begun. Just slightly to melt. Outside the emergency room windows, the New York sky was slowly turning bright. What a cruel twist of fate this is, isn't it? The moment the truth came out, and the moment the child fell ill just happened to collide on the very same night. This wasn't mere coincidence. It was everything Jaehun had spent so long looking away from, coming back to him all at once. It seems the truth always arrives in the moment. We're least prepared for it. 3 days later, Jaehun reached out to Derek Coleman directly. He said he wanted to arrange a dinner as a gesture of reconciliation. And to his surprise, Derek agreed without hesitation. During those 3 days, Jaehun had carefully brought Jasmine and Hajun back to the estate and told his uncle the full truth of the fabricated results, clearing up the misunderstanding within the family as well.
Reconciliation. Huh. Not bad. Sounds like you're finally growing up.
Derek's voice was full of ease. He believed the crack he'd wedged into the Lee family had brought it down completely. But he had no idea that dinner table was already set with a lawyer and with evidence. Jaehun hung up the phone and stood staring out the window for a long time, steadying himself. The snow had already stopped, and the sky, for once in a long while, was clear.
This time, I end it face to face, not with silence.
On the appointed night, candles burned low across the estate's great hall. Derek walked in with all his usual confidence. but he so quickly sensed the room wasn't what he'd expected. On the table sat a single envelope of documents. In place of wine glasses, by the fireplace stood the lawyer, and a few familiar men from the organization stood quietly by the door.
What is this? You said this was a reconciliation dinner.
A reconciliation starts with confirming the truth first.
Jaehun's voice was low and steady, but there was already a resolve settled deep within it. It was the first time Derek's eyes had ever flickered. Outside, snow had begun falling again, lightly.
I stayed up 3 nights straight preparing for this moment.
The lawyer pulled the documents from the envelope and laid them out on the table, one by one. The forged test results, the researcher's signed statement, and even a photo of Derek's business card. The evidence piled up layer after layer. Under the candlelight, those documents were dismantling, piece by piece, the lie Derek had spent weeks building.
These test results were fabricated by the Coleman, side from the very start. Both the lab employee's testimony and the physical evidence confirm it.
The room froze solid in an instant. The easy smile drained completely from Derek's face. He forced himself to laugh. But the laugh was already cracked. Jaehun didn't miss the way. Derek's fingers gripped the edge of the table.
Evidence can be faked just as easily. You think something like this is going to shake me?
Just then, the doors of the great hall opened and Jasmine walked in, Hajun cradled in her arms. No one had expected her to appear. Derek's face visibly hardened. Jasmine had waited for this exact moment, as she and Jaehun had arranged in advance.
The price for selling lies over. My child, you're going to pay it in full, tonight.
Jasmine's voice didn't waver. She walked toward Derek step by step, looking him dead in the eye. In every step was all the tears and patience she'd swallowed over the past 10 days. For the first time, Derek found himself at a loss for words in front of this woman, oblivious to the tension between the adults. Hajun slept peacefully in his mother's arms. Derek stepped back, but Jaehun's men were already standing quietly. At the door of the hall, his escape route had just been cut off entirely. Cold sweat had already broken out across his forehead.
You people think you have the right to do this to me? I'm the man who runs half this city. Have you forgotten that?
That other half is about to go down along with it.
Jaehun's answer was short and firm. By the next morning, he'd already set investigations and lawsuits in motion against Derek's entire business empire all at once. Bank accounts were frozen, and the business partners he'd spent years cultivating turned their backs on him one after another. Jaehun never drew a single weapon, and still, he tore down everything Derek had spent a lifetime building, one document at a time. In just over 2 weeks, Derek Coleman's empire collapsed. Under a mountain of paperwork, the connections and power he'd been so sure of scattered, like a sandcastle in the face of the truth. The news began running his name alongside charges of fraud and evidence tampering. The people who'd once stood loyally by his side turned and walked away one by one the moment word got out.
Power's a funny thing. It falls apart this easily in the face of one single truth.
Jaehun muttered to himself, bittersweet, as the news reached him. What washed over him before any satisfaction was the sobering realization that all of this chaos had started with his own hasty silence. He stood at his study window, watching the news of Derek's downfall for a long while. It occurred to him, suddenly, that there had been a moment when he hadn't been so different from Derek himself. Those 6 days when his own silence had driven someone to the very edge. That night, Jaehun went back to the club where Jasmine had been staying. This time, no sedan, no men, he came alone. In the club's back courtyard, in a spot blanketed with fresh snow, he knelt down. Nadia watched from behind the window for a moment, then quietly drew the curtain closed.
I'm kneeling here before you to ask your forgiveness. My doubt, my silence. It's only now that I truly understand how much pain they caused you and Hajun.
Jasmine looked down at him in silence for a long time. Here was the head of a 3-generation Mafia dynasty, kneeling in the snow, Snowflakes were settling, one by one, onto his shoulders. She walked slowly toward him and rested a hand on his shoulder.
Get up. An apology isn't something you give on your knees. It's something you prove with time.
Then I'll spend that time properly. Starting now, right by your side. And Hajun's.
We'll see. Don't forget it's time that proves it, not words.
Jaehun slowly rose to his feet. There was still time to make up for between them. But at least that night, the snow no longer stood between them the way it once had. Jasmine gently brushed the snow off his knees with her fingertips.
There are things power can't protect. I learned that far too late. Still, better late than never, right?
In the distance, they could hear Hajun's babbling. At the sound, Jaehun's hardened expression softened for the first time into something gentle. The snow had stopped, and only the glow of the club sign lit their two shadows side by side. Together, they walked inside. Nadia watched them and quietly set down 2 cups of coffee. The next day, Jaehun went to see his uncle and gave him a full account of everything that had happened. Even his uncle's stern face showed a flicker of shock at the revelation that Derek Coleman had been behind the fabricated results.
So then, that boy was our blood all along. I let myself be fooled and turned that child away.
Jaehun nodded quietly. His uncle went a long while without speaking, before finally, gravely, he opened his mouth.
If our family's rules cause someone real harm, then those rules need to change. I was far too rigid about this.
I learned the hard way this time that there are things more important than rules.
That woman and that child, let's welcome them properly into this family's name, starting now.
A long silence passed between the two men, but unlike the icy silence of before, this one, little by little, was melting toward each other. From that day on, his uncle personally struck out one old clause from the family's rulebook. News of Derek Coleman's downfall spread through New York's back alleys in no time. Most of his men scattered, and what remained of his business was sold off for a fraction of its worth. Along Brooklyn's jazz club strip, a peaceful night air settled in for the first time in a long while.
So that Coleman fella finally got what was coming to him. World's fair after all. Heaven's always watching, I tell you.
Nadia laughed at that, clinking her glass. Jasmine was back up on stage, playing the piano, and this time, Jaehun sat quietly in the corner seat beside her. The customers glanced at the unlikely pair now and then, but no one bothered to ask. A man in a black suit sitting in the corner of a jazz club. It was becoming, little by little, not such an unusual sight on this street anymore. A month later, the magnolias were blooming again in the estate garden. This time, instead of some ominous chill, a warm spring breeze drifted through the petals. Hajun's walking had come along quite a bit, and he now filled the estate's hallways with his unsteady little footsteps, where cold, discarded documents once lay scattered. On the rug by the fireplace, colorful toys were strewn about instead.
Young master, not that way. Heading for the fireplace again. Are you?
Watching the old caretaker chase after Hajun, breaking a sweat, Jasmine burst out laughing. The sound of her laughter echoing through this house wasn't such an unfamiliar sight anymore. The hallway that had once held nothing but silence was now filled, every day, with Hajun's laughter. Jaehun, far from avoiding the noise, had become someone who rushed through his day's work just to dive back into it.
Is it strange that I missed all this noise?
She scooped Hajun up into her arms and carried him well, away from the fireplace, over to the couch. His delighted giggling rang all the way up to the ceiling. As promised, his uncle personally revised the family rulebook. Beside the clause on proving bloodline, a new line had been added, but that proof can never stand in for the human heart. It was the first time in 3 generations that this cold, unbending rulebook had ever carried a warm sentence.
Well, would you look at that? I never thought that stubborn old man had a line like this in him.
The lawyer read the clause. and shook his head in disbelief. The air inside the estate was completely different from what it had been months before. In the place where an icy silence had once lived, the sound of a child's laughter and people's footsteps had taken its place. Ever since writing that clause, the uncle had taken to visiting the estate once a week just to watch Hajun's antics. This was a man who'd once ruled people's futures with nothing but a rulebook now. He was an old man breaking into a wide grin in front of a boy who might as well have been his own grandson.
This little rascal, that smile is the spittin' image of Jaehun's back when he was a boy.
As the night deepened, Jaehun stood beside Jasmine, in front of Hajun's crib. Outside the window, the stars were unusually bright.
Remember? The night we first met at the jazz club, you handed me a piece of sheet music and said something.
Something about there being an invisible thread, I think I said.
It struck Jasmine, strange and yet oddly comforting, that he still remembered those words. Jaehun gently took hold of Hajun's small hand where he lay sleeping in the crib. His fingers were long and slender, just like Jasmine's.
These fingers will he grow up to play the piano too, someday? That thread, it seems it's, reached all the way to this child too. You and me, and now him. A thread no fabrication could ever cut.
Then don't you dare let go of it again.
I'll keep the promise I make here, before this crib, for the rest of my life. I'll be the man who stands by you and Hajun before anything else, before power, before all of it.
There was no more ice left in Jaehun's voice. In its place was the sincerity he'd held back for far too long. Jasmine took his hand without a word. Starlight from the window settled quietly over their clasped hands.
I'm going to check on that promise every single day until this child is grown. You'd better be ready.
I'm counting on it.
Jaehun laughed out loud for the first time. At the sound, Hajun stirred slightly in his crib, and the two of them held their breath together, looking at each other. In that brief moment, the 3 years of silence that had once wrapped around this whole house finally, completely seemed to melt away. A few days later, the two of them went back to Nadia's jazz club. As Jasmine took the stage, Jaehun sat in the corner seat, just like that night 3 years ago, watching her. Instead of cigarette smoke, the club was filled this time with the warm scent of coffee.
You come here often?
Starting today, I'll come every day. For real, this time.
They traded that old joke back and forth, laughing. Hajun slept soundly in the little basket beside the stage, and the club filled once again with peaceful piano music. Nadia watched it all from behind the counter, running her fingers gently over an old saxophone. Someday, she found herself wondering, might that saxophone find its way back onto a stage too? As summer began, a small commitment ceremony was held in the estate garden. In place of a lavish wedding, it was a modest gathering, just the people closest to them. His uncle offered, unasked, to officiate, and Nadia held back, tears as she snapped photos.
It fills me with joy to finally tie the knot on these two properly right here.
Jasmine stood in a white dress, her natural afro framing, her face just as it always did, and Jaehun, tie loosened slightly, unlike his usual self, stood facing her. The garden's magnolias were in full bloom again, petals drifting down over their heads. Hajun, in his uncle's arms, watched the whole scene with wide, curious eyes.
From that night 3 years ago until now, you've always been the truest person in my life. From here on, I promise, in front of everyone gathered here, to protect that truth without a shred of doubt.
Jasmine's eyes brimmed red. She squeezed Jaehun's hand tight and finally let loose the tears she'd held back for so long. Nadia, forgetting even to press the camera shutter, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. After the ceremony ended, Nadia quietly pulled Jasmine aside. The two of them sat together, on a bench in a quiet corner of the garden.
Honestly, when I saw you show up that first night with a suitcase and a baby, I never imagined a day like this would come.
Me neither. That night, it really felt like the whole world was ending.
Nadia squeezed Jasmine's hand and smiled a deep, warm smile, the kind only someone who'd spent years running that club alone could carry.
Now come fill that stage every once in a while, alright? The regulars keep saying they can't live without your playing.
Of course. You're the one who gave me my first stage. I couldn't repay that debt in a lifetime.
That evening, Jaehun sat alone in his study, sorting through an old file box. Inside, a copy of the test. Results from 3 years ago was still there. He looked it over for a long moment, then quietly tossed it into the fireplace. The sound of paper burning filled the study with a sound entirely unlike that old silence.
This piece of paper will never come between us again.
Flames swallowed the paper as it burned. In that light, Jaehun felt, for the first time, a complete and full sense of peace. Outside the door, he could hear Hajun's unsteady footsteps and Jasmine's laughter together. He closed the file box and followed those sounds out of the room. Where he was headed now wasn't paperwork, it was people. As autumn deepened, the estate held Hajun's first birthday celebration. On the traditional doljabi table sat a stethoscope, a paintbrush, a spool of thread, and even a small, model piano keyboard, all laid out in a row. His uncle had personally picked out a handbook and carefully dressed Hajun in it.
Now then, let's see what our Hajun picks.
Hajun glanced around the table for a moment, then reached out with a chubby hand and grabbed hold of the spool of thread. At the sight, Jasmine and Jaehun burst out laughing at exactly the same time.
The thread. The invisible thread.
This little guy already knows. The whole story about his mom and dad, it seems.
Laughter filled the estate garden, spilling over everywhere after a long time without it. Nadia bustled around with the camera, trying not to miss a single moment. And the trumpet player, swept up in the joy, launched into an impromptu song right there on the spot. Standing in the middle of all that noise, Jaehun found himself unexpectedly, remembering the moment he'd knelt and prayed in that hospital hallway 3 years ago.
That prayer. Back then, it really did come true, in the end.
What a strange, fortunate story this turned out to be, wouldn't you say? A single fabricated piece of paper had torn this family apart, but in the end it was human sincerity that stitched them back together. What power alone could never protect this couple, safeguarded with a single word of apology. What is it this old tale means to tell us? That the bonds between people are never something to be judged by a piece of paper or a single number. That's the truth of it. The more doubt takes hold, the more we ought to look first for sincerity, and it's no different a truth that, while we put off a single word of apology, the person standing beside us might drift further and further away. The truth comes out in the end, but it's the heart of the one who stayed all the way until that truth was revealed. That turns out to be the most precious thing of all. An invisible thread may not be something the eye can see, but in the hands of someone who gave their whole heart, it seems it never truly breaks. This story is a work of fiction,